Proportions are the foundation of any great drawing. They can truly make or break your art. No matter how beautiful your shading or rendering is, if the proportions are off, the drawing just won't look good at all. That's why getting your proportions right should be a top priority for every artist, especially if you're a beginner artist. Just so you know, I'm not an art teacher or a professional artist, at least not yet. I'm simply learning the fundamentals and sharing my learnings through my practices online. My goal is to keep improving and hopefully one day become as good as the artists I look up to. And if you're on the same journey, maybe you can learn something from my experiences too. Like the other practice sessions on this channel, I'm starting with proportions first. The drawing stage is so important that I think it deserves our full attention, especially when it comes to observing and getting the proportions right, which is something I personally need to implement even more in my own studies. One way I have learned to achieve this is to spend more time on just looking and comparing the reference, not drawing anything but simply observing and staying with it. You can also make mental notes while observing, like noticing the relationship between the length of the legs in comparison to the length of the torso, what angle are those lines falling at roughly, how long the lower legs are when compared to the length of the thighs, regardless of the perspective yet. Because this is not a study of perspective, we will get to that later, but for now, just focusing on simplifying the reference into as little lines or shapes as possible, we can learn to go beyond the details and see the bigger picture. It might sound really simple or even a bit silly, but this idea of spending more time just looking at the reference without drawing anything has been very profound for me. It is something I still struggle with even though it seems so easy. I find myself feeling anxious and rushing through the drawing process to this day. I'm still trying to slow down and overcome this. What helps me is reminding myself that to see real growth in art, we should not only train our hand-eye coordination, but also must practice the skill of observation, which comes before we even pick up the pencil. So the more we practice our observation, the more progress we will see in our art. This brings us to the next method for working on proportions. Something I described earlier, simplification. By using our observation to draw the reference with just a few lines or shapes, we can create a strong foundation for the rest of the drawing. The ability to simplify the reference into as few shapes as possible is very important because it forces us to focus only on the proportions. For example, we can use a simple rectangle to block in the torso, or we can simplify this reference by seeing and drawing that invisible line running from the head down to the foot of the extended leg, then block in the rest of the figure in the same manner. Working on the bigger areas before we dive into the details helps us understand the proportions much more clearly. If forms are a bit hard to understand right now, or if you're still learning about them, as I am, you can take the help of lines and shapes and use them along with careful observation to study their angles and scale like I have tried doing in this video. Remember, proportions are always in relation to each other. It's that relationship we need to figure out and be able to draw. That said, simplifying with forms is also extremely helpful since forms themselves are built from lines and shapes anyway, so whichever works best for you is perfectly fine. I have practiced it in my previous 2 videos. I have found that working digitally with the reference and the art side by side at the same scale really helps. When what we are drawing is next to our canvas at the same scale, it becomes much easier to compare and spot mistakes. That way, making corrections feels simpler and more effective. If the practice is entirely focused on proportions, we can even check our work by placing the reference layer on top of our art and lowering the opacity. This helps us identify mistakes, understand why something was challenging, and then try again with the layer turned off. I'm not saying that every piece we create with the help of a reference should be an exact copy. Rather, we can see it as a guide to understand what we are getting right and where we need to improve. Of course, we don't want to become human printers producing art, but for practice, this method can be incredibly helpful. With these methods, we can help make our proportions judgment better over time. The other techniques that you have probably heard of, such as the sighting method, which involves holding a pencil as a measuring tool to compare the proportions in a subject. For example, you might measure how long the length of the torso is to its width using this method. So these are all the methods I know of. Honestly, the block-in method was something I had not really studied before, even though I had been using it in different ways without realizing it. The sighting method is something I was taught before, but I don't really use it as much. The idea of finding good enough proportions purely through observation is definitely a nice skill to have. Having other methods to choose from is a nice advantage too. I learned these ideas from a course I am taking right now. I believe we should not shy away from seeking help or finding resources which are systematically and efficiently designed, because they can be far more effective than following some random curriculum, which I think many of us have done at some point. Although I know some people do incredibly well with just YouTube being their major source of learning, so it depends from person to person. But for most people, if it is possible, finding structured resources is a great step forward. This is what I have learned so far about proportions that has been helpful in my own practices. I have other practice sessions on how I use simplification in my studies, so feel free to check those out if you are interested. Please share your thoughts and opinions on this. Let's keep learning and growing together. Thank you, and I will see you in the next practice session.